Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I welcome Dr. Barbara Oakley back to the podcast. She is a distinguished professor of engineering and co-instructor of the world-renowned Learning How to Learn massive online course. Our conversation centered on her Wall Street Journal opinion piece titled Censorship Hurts Our Brains, Literally. The first thing we touched on in our discussion was talking about neuroscience and free speech. She explained that exposure to differing viewpoints is essential for cognitive flexibility and how emotional upset literally impedes rational thought when we engage with challenging ideas. We then examined how the modern pursuit of safe spaces can ironically lead to a heightened acceptance of hostility toward people with different political views. As we talked about K-12 education and free speech, we explored the difficulty of promoting civic thought in the K-12 spaces, with the tension between academic freedom and the need for interventions to overcome ineffective educational practices. We also spent some time on her critique of constructivism. There, Barb argued that pure constructivism in education is completely opposed to neuroscience. As you may know, if you're a regular listener here, I'm not sure I completely agree with that characterization, and if we had more time, I would have liked to get into some of the nuances there, but the way she described a balanced use of inquiry is very similar to what we advocate for with our knowledge-rich inquiry model. I think that highlights an important point that we should look to move away from the binary messaging of either using explicit instruction or inquiry, and instead move that conversation to recognize that there are multiple approaches to teaching and learning that are highly dependent on context, including teacher skill, desired academic outcomes, and what students bring to the table. Finally, we discussed the tension between order and liberty and how a perceived loss of public safety and order can make a population more willing to compromise essential liberties, including free speech. I always enjoy talking with Barb, and if you're interested to hear us talk more about the constructivism argument, you might listen to our 2018 podcast conversation titled Learning to Learn, Rote Memorization or Constructivism, and I'll be sure to link to that conversation, which was published well before our name change in 2023, in the show notes. We'll also include a link to enroll for free in that course that Barb talked about. She was gracious enough to share a link for that, and the title of that course is Speak Freely, Think Critically, the Free Speech Balance Act. She is a co-instructor with several others, including Greg Lukianoff of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, who was a previous guest on this podcast in 2021, and that episode is number 249, Drafting Principles to Protect K-12 from Indoctrination. As always, I encourage you to visit our website if you're interested in our professional learning. You can find that at wegrowteachers.com, and I'm excited to announce that we have two new options on our website. If you're interested in project-based learning, you can now find our new AI PBL design tool, which we have developed in collaboration with Inquire. You can find that in the top menu and in various places around the website. It's a really great tool to help reduce some of the friction and do some ideation in the project-based learning space, and coupled with our professional learning is a really great way to get to high-quality project-based learning. So I encourage you to check that out. And if you're interested in differentiated instruction, we now offer a differentiated instruction online course. Again, you can find that in the top menu if you choose the online courses, and you'll see it among the other online courses, PBL On Demand and Creating a Culture of Inquiry. We will probably be coupling our PBL On Demand online course with the AI PBL design tool, so keep a lookout for that. But please reach out if you are interested in any of our professional learning. You can reach me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now on to my conversation with Barb Oakley. I am with Barbara Oakley, and I'd like to welcome her back to the podcast here. It's been, as the kids say, 6 or 7 years since she was on, and It was in our previous name, Teach Thought, the Teach Thought podcast, but we'll link to that in the show notes. And happy to have her back on, and want to give her an opportunity to reintroduce herself and give, potted bio and all those kinds of things before we talk about all kinds of things, I'm sure, but focusing specifically on the issue of free speech and your recent piece in the Wall Street Journal. But Barbara, welcome back. Let's give the listeners and viewers now some potted bio about you.
Oh, okay. Well, my name is Barb Oakley. I'm a distinguished professor of engineering at Oakland University, which is kind of odd because I grew up hating math and science and thinking I would never have anything to do with that kind of thing as an adult. But after I was getting out of the military, where I had served as a linguist during the 70s and 80s, I found that I kind of fell in love with math and science. And so anyway, I teach some of the world's largest courses on learning, including Learning How to Learn for Coursera with my compatriot, Terry Sinowski, the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute. And I'm really interested in how people learn, how people think, and also in how we can fool ourselves into thinking we're doing something that's good that actually isn't good at all.
Okay. And one of the things, like I said, that I want to focus on and talk about is your September 16th piece, an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, and that is Censorship Hurts Our Brains, literally. Neuroscience confirms the importance of free speech to individual citizens and to democracy itself. Some folks, if they're regular listeners, will know that this is, a passion of mine, and the sort of Enlightenment, civic, and intellectual principles and traditions that I think are really, really important and have been, neglected over decades, I would say, in the K-12 space, and that's part of some of the reasons I think for our current political, tribalism and polarization, but not the only thing. Free speech is one of those things, but I hadn't thought about it, especially from the neuroscience perspective. So what's the elevator pitch on your Wall Street Journal opinion piece here?
Oh, gosh. I think it reflects on many different aspects of free speech, but fundamentally, students grow up in safe spaces. In fact, many meetings, and kids will have conferences and meetings together. And the first thing that will be announced is, this is a safe space for everyone. Mm. And as soon as that's announced, of course, you actually know that it's a completely unsafe space, because if you say anything that kind of doesn't sit quite right with someone, then you have just kind of made some trouble, and you can never predict what you might say that wouldn't sit quite right with someone. So we've had this sort of evolving and ever deepening, almost a cult of safety, and we don't hurt anybody, that has now spun wildly out of control, in that it's just fine to hurt people if they are of differing political beliefs than you. And I'm still kind of suffering from whiplash about how swiftly we went from safe spaces for everyone to, hey, it's okay for me to say, that shooting people I don't like was a good thing to do, it's a whiplash kind of thing, but that's kind of the situation we've evolved into.
Yeah, it is really, I guess whiplash is a good way to put it. Again, I have two daughters, 16 and 18, and I try to have these conversations with them about the importance of being okay with feeling discomfort. My oldest is now in her first year of elementary education certification program to be a teacher, and one of the classes she's taking is a history class, and she's been asked to debate something about slavery. I'm a little bit unclear exactly, but she said that she's supposed to be arguing something affirmatively about slavery, of which she, understandably thinks that is not the position one should take with regards to slavery. But she said, I don't want to, and my group doesn't want to. And I said, well, you should get over that pretty quickly, right? Like, it's okay to debate and have argument about things, even taking a position that you may not like, because, as John Stuart Mill would say, something like, if you don't know the argument of the other side, you certainly don't know yours very well. From the neuroscience perspective, and again, that's one of the focuses of the article or the piece that you wrote. How does this sort of play out in your mind from a neuroscience perspective?
Well, I think there's many different ways one could look at things, but when you find something really upsetting, it can be difficult to kind of take your cognition in hand, put your emotional upset to the side, and just try to grapple, with whatever you're facing, in a conscientious manner. And the example that I often think of is when I was a kid, we had a veterinary clinic. My father was a veterinarian, and it was attached to our house. And so my dad would kind of sometimes open the door, come bolting in and say, hey, come and hold this dog down while I cut the leg off, or something like that, because you're trying to save the dog's life. And so you jump up from the dinner table and you're suddenly finding yourself, holding down a dying dog or something. And your emotions go, oh my gosh, and you can get all bent out of shape, but you're certainly not thinking. If you let that happen, you're not thinking rationally, and you're not really able to act in the situation in a manner that's helpful for all concerned. And I really think that kind of thing actually goes on, maybe not that dramatic, in many different instances in life. You may be, finding yourself speaking with someone who, truly believes that women should be completely subservient to men, and that's what their God had sort of dictated, and that's the way life is. And you're looking on as the wife is silently sitting and looking at you from behind her veil and so forth. And it doesn't help to sit there and go, I think that's really wrong. Because someone who's raised in those kinds of beliefs, that it's very, very firmly in there. But the best you can do is, hold on to your emotions, try to deal with that situation in as reasonable a fashion as you can, and learn why people are thinking that way. So I'm not sure if that really addressed the question, but I hope it gives a bit of insight that's relevant.
Yeah, I guess one of the things is, again, I think about how we approach teaching and learning, and should approach teaching and learning. And of course, folks will know, and one of the things we talked about in our previous conversation years ago was the role of inquiry and the way that plays out in teaching and learning. And it strikes me as a sort of mindset in terms of how we approach the building of knowledge, and how we engage with students and use that sort of curiosity, and I guess in some ways build a sense of skepticism in some ways, right? Like, is that really true? Ask continually, sort of building in that mindset and asking, is that really true, or how might that be true, and what ways might that be true? And, that might certainly look different in a math class versus a history class or social studies class. Although I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, in a math or science, from a math or science perspective, which is a little bit more concrete and hard science than a humanities or social studies. Is it valuable? Does it build, certain neural pathways or habits of mind? I would say critical thinking skills. Maybe that's not the right term, and we can get into that. But from that sort of neuroscience perspective, of building those, I guess, again, sort of mindsets and the way that we are sort of trained to think and think about thinking and think about learning. Yeah, and I'm not even sure if there's a question there, but like, how does that play out in how ideally should that play out in a K-12 space from a teacher's perspective in your mind?
I think that the earlier on you can be exposed to differing viewpoints and to kind of practice taking different perspectives and thinking about things in different ways, the better off you are. And I often find, and this has really shocked me when I go around the world, that when I meet people who are able to grapple honestly with ideas that may be alien to them, but they're able to really just look at it instead of just doing a knee-jerk, hey, this is what everybody else thinks and this is what I think too. People who are more cognitively flexible have often, when I ask them about it, they've often like moved around a lot when they were young, or or somehow been exposed to several cultures growing up.
Right.
And I think that gives them practice in just sort of not thinking that their way is the right way, and automatically anybody who thinks differently has got to be wrong. And so, and there's kind of proof in the sense that they look at East Germany, where creativity and looking at things from different perspectives was really quite suppressed during, East Germany's heyday as a communist bloc country. And you even see echoes of it today in that there seems to be less creativity emerging from those regions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, and I do see when I travel around some former communist bloc countries that in some of them there's still a fear and a suspiciousness and a rigidity that I think has become a part of the culture, and really is very difficult for people to think more flexibly and openly and creatively. So I worry sometimes that some, in the West, there seems to be increasing suppression of free speech. And that means less exposure to ideas that are different because those have not been allowed to be conveyed on social media and so forth. And, and I just wonder and worry that society will become more sort of inflexible as a consequence.
Yeah. Well, in that article, you mentioned Cass Sunstein, who is an author of many books. His latest book is one I'm reading now, which is about liberalism and defense of liberalism. And one thing I don't know, I'm curious if you've sort of dived into this much, but the sort of post-liberal and or anti-liberalism, and when we speak of liberalism, we want to make sure that people don't misunderstand that as in sort of Democrat, left, leftist, that kind of thing. That's not the same thing. And in most of the world, people don't think of liberal as in opposition to the right and that kind of thing. Liberalism as in Enlightenment liberalism. But there's a growing post-liberal movement on the right, Patrick Deneen and Yoram Hazony and these folks who are making the case pretty strongly, and in my understanding, have some significant, or at least not insignificant, sort of influence on the current administration and some of the movers and shakers on the sort of reshaped, to put it nicely, GOP and Republican Party. And I would say, there's sort of a post-liberal or anti-liberal version on the left, which took a lot of the form of social justice and some of the fragility kinds of things that you mentioned. So I'm curious how much, as you mentioned, Cass Sunstein, how much you have thought about that, or any sort of thoughts that you might have on those factors as they are, in some ways, I think, really pushing on the issue of free speech in ways that are I think, very, very dangerous.
I think I don't have a resolution, or I'm not even sure I know what my own opinion is on things, but I do believe that one thing that many Americans just don't even think about is the importance of safety in any culture. And when you have safety gradually going away from a culture, it's a little bit like that frog in the hot water.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I'm pretty much just an old-fashioned classical liberal myself. But I do look at things like what's going on in El Salvador, and I'm like, what would you rather have, the highest death rate in the world, or one of the lowest death rates in the world, and all of a sudden investment coming in and so forth, and you're, like, I don't know how to solve that issue, because part of it is it involves lawyers, and lawyers in the US really are a far bigger presence than they are in most countries around the world. And if sometimes I think lawyers forget about the safety of the population, and sometimes even political parties can forget about the safety of a population. And I think actually people's safety is a factor. And, one should want to be keeping that in mind. And I'm not exactly sure if that's even relevant to but I think
are you sort of referring to the sort of Mussolini getting trains to run on time kind of dynamic of, like, we'll sacrifice some of our liberty for an authority that is, keeping us safe, and that kind of thing?
Well, that kind of makes it sound like it's a trivial thing that having the trains run on time.
Which he, by the way, didn't actually do. Mussolini didn't actually do.
I go to Guatemala, and like my husband and I wanted to go to a restaurant that was 3 blocks away from our hotel, for our anniversary, and we had to take a cab to do that because you couldn't safely walk 3 blocks in downtown Guatemala City, in the biggest, bestest area of town. That's a real problem. That's and I just it's I think there's something somehow going wrong with governments, whether left or right, who are losing sight of the fact that safety is something that should be an important factor for any population. Somehow I just think that, well, and then, of course, there's debt and our grandchildren's payment of our own debts. And so, and that never really it's rarely mentioned on the left or the right.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. These are the kinds of things that I worry most about.
Yeah, I think I think that it seems intuitively clear to me that the left and right, and most recently, I think the left has, allowed or created the conditions that give a lot of people sort of some unease, right? That they feel like things are going in the wrong direction. That we have less safety, we have less of the things that we would expect of our country and our government. And when those kinds of things happen, in the metaphor of making the trains run on time, I think does come into play, because you say, well, again, what am I willing to give up? What of my liberties am I willing to give up in order for the metaphorical trains to run on time, for things to get back to at least some sense of order, and you may say safety, all of the, I mean, there's a number of issues that people feel pretty strongly about, and they're not the only things, I don't think, but there's a sense of tribalism, there's social media, there's a number of, it's multivariate, right? But the ways in which people will compromise and give up something like free speech in order to feel a little bit more settled in those things, I think is certainly at play. It's kind of getting back to the classroom in the realm of teaching. When you think about and talk about sort of the importance of multiple perspectives and different ideas and that kind of thing, do you see that playing out in the K-12 space in math and science, or is it more in the sort of social studies and humanities?
Oh, I think it's in all of them. Sadly, there's a teaching philosophy known as constructivism has really taken over, not only in the US, but really it's prominent all around the world. And this is an idea that sounds really good. It's, that students create their own learning actively, and, that we should foster a student-centered approach to teaching. In other words, kids will, they want to learn. And if we just get out of their way, they'll do that learning. And this is completely opposed in quite a few ways to findings from neuroscience. I mean, learning is really hard. People actually, a lot of students don't want to do it. That's why they lean into ChatGPT and so forth, because it's so much easier. And so what we see playing out in classroom, I'll give you a typical end game of this kind of phenomenon is that New Zealand they have long sort of proudly served as ground zero of constructivist approaches. And as a consequence, they've gone from the top of the industrialized world to the bottom of the industrialized world in their rankings, for example, in ability to do math, to do science, to read, and so forth. And so when you teach using a philosophy that, kids will just put kids together and they'll figure the math out, there's 100 trillion connections in the human brain. That means even to figure out one little problem there are so many ways to go wrong and very, very few ways to go right. So when you have students constructing their own learning, especially in math, which is really difficult. I mean, it took people thousands of years to even figure out the concept of the zero. You're going to have, a nation that is falling further and further behind in the capabilities of their students. And indeed, that's what we're seeing in the US, and that's what we're seeing in Western countries that have incorporated these constructivist approaches, which sounds so good and make things really easy for teachers because they can just say, hey, kids, go at it. You guys learn it. And of course, constructivists would say, we never do that. But that's the upshot of what happens in many classrooms. So I think we're seeing so a lot of kids hate school because they're really not learning much in school. And in fact, many of the approaches being used to teach actually cripple students' abilities to learn. So I think it's no wonder that K-12 is, many parents are really struggling with what they're seeing going on in typical schools. And it's a tremendous, tremendous problem for the country.
So how does that, I guess, correlate to sort of learning about different ideas and the sort of ideas of free speech and different perspectives that we mentioned? And again, maybe it's not as relevant in the sort of math science domains and disciplines, or maybe it is. I don't know how you think about that. As I think you probably know, I'm an advocate of inquiry. And certainly that's more on the constructivist end. I certainly don't think there's much room for what I would say is discovery learning, which is kind of what you're describing. And even Howard Gardner, who was on my podcast, sometime last year, I think, he was very forthright and said, progressive education is sort of jumped the shark there, that we've sort of made the claim that if you just create the conditions, students will learn. And it's certainly not likely to happen. But the other, sort of end of that is much more teacher-centered and sort of really explicit teaching and those kinds of things. So how do you see the sort of multiple perspectives, different ideas kind of coming into play in that model?
Well, see, what great teaching can do is, remember I talked about the 100 trillion connections, a huge high-dimensional neural space, potential solution space. When you talk about inquiry-based learning, what good inquiry-based learning means is that you are asking Socratic questions as a teacher that narrow that potential solution space to a space that becomes tractable for students. It's like, oh, we've only got really only these answers are available instead of like everything, because you're kind of saying, well, what does that 3 mean there? And it seems like a simple question, but you've just pointed that student and narrowed that solution space. And what great inquiry kinds of teaching can do is with Socratic question, it narrows that space, but the student themselves, they will go, oh, well, did she mean this or this? Or maybe, oh, she means this. And they make that final little connection, click themselves, which means they get that little dopamine hit of, aha, I got it, which strengthens those connections. It also gives them the, unfortunately false, but it's okay, idea that they have solved a problem themselves, when actually it was great teaching that led them to that problem to being able to solve that problem. So I'm totally with you that inquiry-based teaching can And to some extent that, to the extent that discovery-based is equivalent to that. But the idea, the important idea here is you can't do that with everything. You're not going to do inquiry-based teaching with gigantic vocabulary lists of Mandarin or something,
Right.
It, but there really is something to that kind of Socratic questioning approach, and there's a point at which constructivism and traditional approaches to teaching intersect and create beautiful ways of learning for students. It's just that most students aren't lucky enough to have teachers that, like in New Zealand, it's amazing. They're like, well, students construct their own learning, so teachers should construct their own teaching materials as well. And it's like, do you know how difficult it is to write a textbook, to come up with these kinds of ideas, to really be able to convey the questions in the proper fashion? That is what is known as direct instruction. Direct instruction is not explicit instruction. It's not just lecture. It's a combination of lecture, very carefully designed lecture to lead students to the aha, where they actively get something, then some more lecture, then back and forth and so forth. And this approach was in the largest educational study ever done in history. That it cost $100 million, done in the I believe it was the 70s. It was a 10-year study, and it was found that direct instruction was so much better than every other approach that was tried that they never published the study. That was called Project Follow Through. And it was simply because direct instruction made every other approach, including all these constructivist approaches, look really bad.
Well, so the way you describe that sort of nexus of using inquiry and questions with the, explicit instruction or direct instruction, and, we don't have time to get into the different versions of that, Rosenshine and Engelman and all those kinds of things, is very close to, if not exactly, what I advocate for. I call it knowledge-rich inquiry, and there's a sort of constructivist element in there, right? There's a sort of last step, or sometimes last step, and sometimes there's different. It can happen in different places. It's not prescriptive. It's not always the same exact formula following that kind of thing, but that you're using the inquiry process in a way that is leading the learning, leading the thinking, right? And getting them to a place where they are having those aha moments. And some of it's, sort of manipulatively constructivist or something like that, right? Like you said, there's sort of like, okay, they feel like they came to it, but not necessarily as much as they actually maybe didn't. But that be as it may, there is that role of inquiry, and so we really want to. In my estimation, Cynthia Nebel, I don't know if you know who she is, but she and I have collaborated on a paper that we're looking to actually get published. Excuse me, that makes a case for sort of what we're talking about here. One of my concerns is, we've sort of outlined some of the problems on the sort of inquiry constructivist side, but in terms of sort of free speech and some of these issues that we started talking about, is I feel like there's such a push from the sort of more science of learning, cognitive science, explicit instruction crowd. Some of the loudest voices actually sort of denigrating inquiry, saying inquiry doesn't work, and there's conflations, there's misrepresentations and that kind of thing. Inquiry is not as efficient, and there's some real art to doing it well, as you noted, and I would acknowledge if we don't do it well, it can be really disastrous. I think that's really important to recognize. But when we're not engaging students in what I would say is rich inquiry, we're there's an opportunity cost that I think is related to this sort of free speech dilemma that we've got, this sort of skepticism, this sort of, is that correct? Is that true? How is that true? How would I know if that's true? Sort of developing, I would say something like critical thinking. Others might call it habits of mind. And it strikes me as really concerning that we have a push, just like we may have a push from the sort of constructivist side of very discovery learning kinds of not knowledge building, knowledge they can find it on the internet, whatever, that we've got a sort of movement from the other end of the spectrum that is pushing inquiry and curiosity and those skills that are related with Enlightenment, liberal tradition, to the side. And I think that's a recipe for further problems. So again, not a question there, but I'm curious what you think of that.
One thing that just shocks me is that when you go back and look at all these different approaches to teaching and like constructivist approaches, and you go look at Dewey and you look at Montessori and you look, everybody always has a really good idea and a very interesting idea. And then it often seems like their followers, go to more and more of an extreme. So even what you and I are talking about here right now, we could come up with the best, most balanced, even-handed approach to teaching and learning that you could possibly imagine. And you know what? If we gave this off to the next generation, it'll go off on some kind of extreme, and you almost can't predict how people are going to misunderstand, misconstrue, whatever. I mean, yes, what you're saying is possible to happen. I don't think it's gone off to an extreme too much yet, but who knows? There's a long history of whatever people come up with, no matter how good it is, at least at the beginning. There seems to be this human tendency to kind of take it into a cult and then take it to an extreme where it becomes harmful rather than beneficial.
Yeah, there's a sense of tribalism that comes into play, right? And I think that's kind of what you're hinting at. And how do we get back to something, or how do we get to something that's more disinterested, right? That it's how do I find out what is actually true here? What's the best approach or the best course of action, regardless of how much I might like it or dislike it, or it fits my priors or fits with my tribe, whether that's in politics or teaching in the reading wars, or can you change your mind? Are you looking to figure out how you're wrong? And in what ways you might be wrong, because you want to be wrong for a short amount of time as possible. And again, one of my fears is that we are rapidly losing touch with that sort of mindset and those skills, which to me is fundamentally an inquiry project. We do need knowledge, but if we don't have those skills, then we're unable to decipher or tell if the knowledge we're being given, which is increasingly, maybe not true, is that true, right? We're seeing all kinds of messages now that say, this is true, that's not true, that's not true, this is true. And so we've got, how do we figure that out? Well, if you just say, well, that's what I've been told and that's what I'm going with, to me, that's a lack of inquiry skills, and it's just really troubling to me.
There's a wonderful book by Michael Strevens called The Knowledge Machine. And this book kind of describes science ultimately as an approach where if two people disagree, they figure out some way of putting forth an experiment or somehow, testing who is right. And if they can't figure it out from that experiment, then they got to come up with another experiment and another one until they, and that's kind of, I think, what free speech is trying to aim us at. You talk about things, see what the difference is, see if you can convince one another or come up with some way to evaluate who might be more onto a, I always hate to say a true approach, because truth is often so very relative unless it comes to how much medication I might need for a certain condition, and will this kill me or not? Then I can say that yes, there is such a thing as this is truly a beneficial medication. But anyway, so I just think that my hope is that in society, in the world, if we just keep moving forward to try to promote and get people to practice interacting with people who think differently than they do, and to start this from K-12, that it will really help them to develop their critical thinking skills and develop their skills in interacting with people of all sorts, which is a pretty valuable skill to have. It's just that we've gone through this sort of really kind of a sad period over the last few decades where increasingly that's been discouraged. And the hope is that that conversations such as yours will help encourage the flowering again of the ability to think and talk with people who think differently than you.
Yeah. Well, I know we want to wrap up here, and I want to give you at least a minute or two, or however much time you want to take to talk about the course that you and Greg Lukianoff have created on free speech, because I think that's important. But if you humor me for a moment, you mentioned critical thinking. This is something I've been really thinking a lot about. And I mentioned a couple of times here, there's, cognitive science generally says or tends to say that critical thinking is domain specific and it's not transferable. And I think that's true, that is, you'll have science critical thinking, math critical thinking, those kinds of things. But it also strikes me as there is something that's more generalized as a sort of critical thinking skill. Some other folks have been talking about as habits of mind. I don't care what we call it, but to recognize what those things are that are the ability to sort of analyze and work through big problems or novel problems, things of which we have no knowledge or very little knowledge about, the sort of habits of mind. So how do you define, if you have a sort of potted definition of critical thinking, what does that sound like in your brain?
I'm always wary of potted definitions of critical thinking, because fundamentally critical thinking is about having knowledge in your own head. I was once asked, a course I had developed at an institution not mentioned here, was once asked, well, would you like to label your course as a critical thinking course for the students who might take it, and then they would get credit for critical thinking? And I said, well, gosh, I'd be delighted to do that, but what's the definition of critical thinking? And they didn't have one. You could just label it whatever you wanted to label it. And so it's kind of a very sad thing when well, let's just say that critical thinking involves developing expertise such that you're able to start questioning more intelligently, and you don't necessarily have to take things for granted. But that's a really, it's a weak definition, and I could probably sit there for days over many different definitions of critical thinking.
Yeah.
And still not be happy with what definition I settled on.
Yeah, it is really, and I think it is complex. It's nuanced, right? The idea, and I hear people say this, and I feel like it's a tribal thing. They've sort of heard it somewhere. They say you can't think critically about nothing, and I said, well, you can't think very deeply critically about nothing. You could look at something you know nothing about and say, what the heck is that? And let me learn more. Let's start to analyze and ask those kinds of questions, and then your critical thinking would improve. But that's a conversation for another podcast in a different time. The course that you've created with Greg is on Coursera. Can you talk about that a little bit? We'll put that in the show notes, and then I'll let you back out into the wild.
Oh, okay. So I gave you the link. There's actually a free, you can have free access to the course. And so this one doesn't just give you the link to the first week, it gives you the link to the entire course. And it's all free. So it was a wonderful, see, Greg is a grand master of knowledge of of free speech, and he very graciously, I read all of his books. I really looked at what was going on. And then Ilya Shapiro has some wonderful ideas as well. He also agreed to be a guest star. And I have Christina Koppel is a neurologist at university in London. And then my usual compatriot, Terry Sinowski, who's the Francis Crick professor at the Salk Institute. But what we did was we pulled together great visuals so you can see what is happening in people's brains when they are like putting up their mental fortress because they don't want to hear what you have to say. And why do those mental fortresses arise? How can you sometimes open those mental fortresses? And the course is propelled by, for example, we start at the very beginning with Ibn Khaldun, who is the very famous kind of like the father of sociology from the 1400s. And he, along with me, is on the ramparts of Damascus in the year 1400 as Tamerlane is attacking, and I'm coughing as the smoke is going by. And we're able to bring in aspects of history. Why are people for free speech? And then they suddenly become against free speech. And what is going on, for example, in a narcissist who might feel attacked when someone says something critical about them, even if it's true? Or what if they say something that's critical about them that's a real flat out lie? So all of these factors kind of play important roles. What's going on in the brain? What are the historical kinds of aspects of free speech? What's the legal ramifications? How do legal things change around the world, and why? So I think it's the best course on free speech around, but then I am a little biased. So there it is.
Yeah, and if folks are not aware, Greg Lukianoff is, I think, the president, CEO, or some title similar to that of FIRE, which is Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Used to be education, now it's expression, and a former podcast guest here because he was talking about, among other things, coddling in the American mind, but also some principles for K-12 and indoctrination related to free speech. I think Ilya Shapiro is with the ADL. Is that correct? Do you remember?
I think he's with maybe Manhattan now. I'm not sure. He's just, it was just so fun to work with him because he's a total natural in front of the camera, and it just made me laugh. And actually, you have to see Greg Lukianoff's outtakes. They are hysterical.
Well, any other links or places you would like for folks to visit, social media or anything like that?
I would just like to say that free speech is so near and dear to my heart that I put a year of effort into just creating what I think is all of our absolute best that we could ever give on this. And so my hope is that you will learn some things about yourself and about society, and that it will be something that helps move us all forward in a very positive way.
Well, Barb, as always, it's a pleasure to speak, and we should not wait 6 or 7 years, as the kids say, to reconvene. I do appreciate the conversation and your work.
Well, thank you very much, and we will see you again, hopefully soon.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.